I started my endurance journey 25 years ago as a 12-year-old boy cycling across Scotland, and I recently pedalled around the planet at the pace of 240 miles a day.
Hi, welcome back to Immersive Sports Science. Content not commentary, sports science not bro science. And in this video, we will be looking at Mark Beaumont's Endurance. And in this video, we'll be talking about Mark Beaumont's book, which accompanies his podcast. It is key to note that the book itself is very much different to the actual podcast. The book details his scientific approach or approaches that you could utilize in order to become a good endurance cyclist or a general road cyclist. His podcast, on the other hand, is more about his own life experiences doing these endurance challenges.
Mark Beaumont famously was the fastest man to cycle round the world, cycling round the world in 78 days. Laura Penhall, the guest producer of his podcast, has been to 4 Olympics with Team GB's medical team. She has also broken 2 world records, leading a all-female team rowing across the Atlantic. Not only was she a major part of Mark Beaumont's endurance attempt, she also helped to co-author this book.
The book itself you can find down in the link below in the resources section of this description. The book basically breaks down into certain chapters detailing certain aspects of cycling and how to live a healthy lifestyle as an elite athlete.
There are many sections to this book, but they can really fit into 3 main domains, that being the coaching in terms of the periodization, but also the coaching and training for this type of cycling, as well as the psychology and nutrition aspects.
The section that I took quite a lot of interest in was the science section, looking at the sports science of cycling.
The Endurance podcast is focused on meeting the sports scientists, the support staff, the researchers, the entrepreneurs, the people you'll have rarely heard of, but who are the experts at supporting endurance athletes and are at the forefront of endurance sports.
What is highly interesting about this book, although the teaching of the science and training is important, these don't come until after chapter 5. What is important though is trying to develop a family, a support team around you and how to get sponsorship and funding for these high endurance events, something that most books don't often talk about or don't touch upon. This is not too dissimilar to how Richard Parkes described his own journey when trying to fundraise for his various events, like trying to be the fastest British man to reach the Antarctic South Pole. Mark breaks down his process of planning and reflection into 4 pillars: athlete, logistics, affordability, and media.
What is interesting about this book is that there's parts of the section where gets you, the reader, if you're willing to partake in endurance cycling or willing to teach it, participate in critical self-reflection. Now, critical self-reflection often gets a bad press, a bad rep, because people often mistake reflection with rumination. Rumination and reflection are not the same thing. Now, there are many different definitions as to what critical self-reflection actually is. But basically, what self-reflection actually is looking back at what you've done and try and make changes, or at least think about what could possibly happen in the future so that you are prepared mentally and physically to meet those demands. It's a higher skill, especially if we add the critical element, if we are critical of ourselves. Rumination is just rethinking over it and not actually taking on those key points, and just arcing on potentially the negatives of those points without necessarily taking those key facts and utilising it as a positive to help improve your training performance or whatever it is that you are looking to improve, that only you as an individual can find those answers. It enables us to find answers about ourselves that only us can answer. When it comes to self-reflection, we are trying to find a meaning to something that can be beneficial to you. Back at your experiences or potentially looking forward at future experiences. And what can you learn from them. My favourite model of critical self-reflection is a modified version of Gibbs 1980, which I have personalised for my own needs. But the thing is, with any form of critical self-reflection, there are hundreds of models out there, many more critiqued, reviewed, more science behind some, more books written about many. But in reality, it's personal to you. How do you critically self-reflect? And for critical self-reflection to work, you need a how, what, why, and when. And if you can answer that from a very specific point, then you have potentially, or could have potentially answered the question or find the answers you are looking for. There is no one perfect way of critical self-reflection. Now, critical self-reflection is a whole wide topic on itself, and it deserves a video for itself regarding sport.
A good example of someone utilising Mark Beaumont's form of planning and reflection is first element endurance. See the description down below for his video.
To be fair, mostly just eating. I haven't drunk any alcohol for 2 weeks now other than on my birthday, and actually that's quite a big deal for me. Eating's been alright, I'd probably give myself 2.5 out of 5. The bike rides were scuppered this week due to having my power tap wheel serviced. I took my wheel to my mate Robin, who basically taught me everything I know about bike repairs, but I'm not very good at it, so I take everything to him anyway.
Nutrition is highly important, and the average tour cyclist needs around 6,000 kcal a day. Nonetheless, in performance tour cycling or stage cycling, weight is highly important because force times mass equals acceleration. That's one of the reasons why cycling has a problem with eating disorders. The ultra endurance cycling Mark does is very much different in terms of his nutritional intake and caloric intake compared to a tour cyclist. He'll probably have a greater balance of fat to carbohydrates within his diet compared to a tour cyclist, who's going to be predominantly more carbohydrates. When talking to Lisa Sammer, an ultra endurance runner, she talked a lot about being hungry but not being able to eat much when she is competing. That must be the same for Mark in his ultra endurance event, being able to put in that nutrition even when you're not hungry, even when your body's deteriorating. The nutritional information was very much on the same par, the same level as Eat, Race, Win, the Amazon Prime documentary.
As any of you know who actually watched my videos previously, or my previous reviews, I'm a stickler for a lot of information. The information within this book itself, although didn't necessarily go into the crazy level scientific information that I particularly like, it did detail the scientific information. Now, it depends how you do that, or you display this information. If you're displaying it to a lay audience, going into that crazy scientific information, although you do want to go into depth, it's not particularly necessary. You don't necessarily need to have all those long-ass quotes. What you do, or what you have to write, or what you do write, has to be scientifically accurate and be able to have enough detail written in such a way that anyone can understand it. Quite often with science written within books or even in film, the science kind of gets lost. There's not enough information for me to think I can actually utilise that within my own life or be able to understand that and be able to implement it. They kind of take you as an idiot. Never take the audience as an idiot. I found that this book did not do that, and that it did give you enough information. The wording didn't necessarily go into the crazy realms of scientific journals, though it is very scientifically accurate what he has written. In terms of the writing mechanics, there is no clear way of hitting you head on first and getting you engaged in it. You have to be engaged in Mark Beaumont's story, or at least engaged in the scientific side of it. It's written like a much simplified version of a journal article, concise and to the point. But what I mean by concise doesn't necessarily mean try and say it in a few words as possible, which he does do. If you need to explain things with many words, explain it with many words, so long that either reader can understand what you're saying. In true 20th, first century fitness textbook layout and look, you have your image, your quote over the top that helps to enhance your text or enhance your meaning. And then you have a concise image that also helps to enhance that. This was no different to any other scientific textbook meant for a wider audience.
The book does a fantastic job, not only Mark Beaumont's endurance attempts, but for you as a lay or an elite athlete. The layout is just like any other scientific textbook, but yet again, it's very contemporary, very much like Edgley's The World's Fittest Book, in which case anyone can pick up and feel comfortable in order to read it. What can normally happen in a podcast when you have such a high-profile individual is that they are often being portrayed as the most dominant figure within that podcast. This podcast did not do that. It's more like how the DCEP Northern Applied Hub do their Talking Psych podcast, sorry, shameless plug there, when they have an individual there and you sit in there and you utilising the knowledge of the other people around them in order to help further enhance the scientific knowledge. Those individuals may have more information than the host of the example where the famous person is the crux and the sole linchpin of the podcast would be that Peter Crouch podcast, where they don't really have a conversation. They're not a participant in the conversation. They are the forefront of all the conversations on that podcast. I couldn't find anything wrong that was problematic with both the podcast and the book, barring the fact that they utilized a lot of advertising that was really stuck or subtly stuck in your face by GCN within the actual book. But other than that, that's pretty much minor, really. In terms of the podcast, the introduction was a bit long. However, he does have a following and they may want to listen to such an individualized introduction to the podcast. Each individual episode had its own individual introduction, even though they were roughly about 5 minutes long.
All in all, I give this book a KSA score of